Z College, bringing you another video about the population policy in China. So, as we have discussed in the past few videos, China has faced massive demographic issues, mainly due to its high population growth. However, in the recent years, Chinese policies have been successful enough to control these issues. And in this video, we're going to see how have these policies become successful, what were the policies used, and what was the implementation strategy. So stay tuned because these policies will be helpful for other countries to control their population growth issues too. Alright, so talking about the population policy in China since 1949, the pattern of demographic change was not accidental, but it actually reflects the impact of the Chinese government's policies towards population during the same time. So let's first take a look at how did these policies come into effect. So Scarping 2003 in the book regarding motives and goals of Chinese birth control, or rather birth control in China, has stated a lot of information regarding this. So having a sneak peek view on them, like the great majority of other policy arenas, Chinese birth control has been overshadowed by the personal beliefs and interventions of Mao Zedong during the first 3 decades of the People's Republic. So, this commenced in September 1949 on the eve of the founding of the new state Mao, and he declared that each time the Chinese overthrew a feudal dynasty, it was because of the oppression and exploitation of the people by the feudal dynasty, and not because of any overpopulation. And he also clearly stated that it's a very good thing that China has a big population, and even if China's population multiplies many times, China will be fully capable of finding a solution, and the solution is production. So Mao Zedong suggested that if the country produces more, even if the population growth multiples, there's not going to be an issue. So the absurd argument of Western bourgeois economists like Malthus that increases in food cannot keep pace with increasing population was not only being thoroughly refuted in theory by Marxists long ago, but also has been completely exploded by the realities in the Soviet Union and the liberated areas of China after their liberation. So, revolution plus production can solve the problem of feeding the population. This was the view that was held by Mao Zedong. This verdict was in rebuttal of an American white book on relations with China, published shortly before, which cited demographic evidence for explaining the Guomindang debacle on the mainland. Issued as the last text in the official canon of his selected writings, Mao's vehement criticism fully confirmed with Stalin's views and the reason of Soviet theoreticians. It was long treated as a beacon light guiding all Chinese population policies, and in 1952, it led the party organ to spread the diatribes against proponents of birth control, with articles proclaiming the thesis, birth control can ruin China. It means murder without shedding blood. So the denunciations came at a time of intensifying thought reform among non-communist intellectuals and the abolishment of all university programs in the bourgeois social sciences. Seen from this historical perspective, however, some strange affinities emerged from the battle lines of ideological class struggle, and for the American White Book of August 1949 had based its assessment on the analysis of Frank Notastiel, the noted American demographer who was to become one of the fathers of the international family planning movement and a source of inspiration for Chinese birth control in later years. In turn, Mao Zedong shared basic perceptions of his political opponents, the Kuomintang leaders from the preceding Republican period. Bemoaning high population losses since the mid-19th century and stressing the need to combat foreign encroachments, both Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek had urged high demographic growth for safeguarding national independence. Whether consciously or subconsciously, the men at the helm of the Chinese Republic inherited the traditional ideas of Chinese emperors who cherished high population numbers, since these bolstered tax revenues and strengthened military manpower against hostile barbarian tribes. So, the pro-natalist stand of China's leaders was not uncontroversial. But, starting in the early years of the Republic, a growing number of social scientists had come to view China's population more as a liability than as an asset. They believed the poverty and economic backwardness, the low standards of health and education, as well as the prevalent food problems of the country were all intimately connected with the problem of overpopulation. Amid the ranks of sociologists and among a minority of politicians, birth control had already become a catchword in the 1930s. Arguments between proponents and opponents of birth control continued to surge back and forth during the 1950s. Public pronouncements were dominated by constant reference to Mao's dictum of 1949 and by Marxist criticism of Malthusian thought. The criticism was bolstered by reliance on the Soviet Union, where Stalin's policy reversal of 1936 had led to the reinstatement of pre-revolutionary family norms, the promotion of childbearing, and a ban of the abortions that had been permitted by Lenin. Soviet policies under Stalin agreed with the 1935 Criminal Code from Kuomintang, China, that had penalized abortion, permitting it only in case of danger to the mother's life. Again, there existed a basic unity of outlook between the adversaries of the Chinese Civil War, despite experimentation with extremely liberal marriage laws. All punitive codes in the revolutionary base areas of the Communist Party had penalized abortion between 1931 and 1948. The Central Party organ People's Daily summed it up neatly in 1951, while imperialist and capitalist states further birth control, socialist and democratic states promoted childbearing. The convictions of Chinese modernism met with the traditions of Chinese feminism, which continued to permeate wide segments of society despite growing fissures in the old family system. This contained the pro-natalist ideals of an elite culture which honored early marriage and abundant offspring. In Chinese public discourse during the first half of the 20th century, abortion and birth control continued to be largely taboo subjects. The continuing depth of social censure may be gleaned from the fact that in April 1950, rules for army and government personnel in the Beijing region made abortion contingent on medical indications plus the written consent of husbands, superiors, and doctors. Given the strong patrilineal hierarchy in Chinese families, in real life the husband's parents would have to be added to the list. So, moreover, all the cadres in central government and party organs had to obtain the personal endorsement of the Minister of Health himself, which was quite hectic. When second thoughts about the burden of a huge population resurfaced in 1953-54 period, they focused on the difficulty of providing universal education for the ever-growing number of school-age children and the need to protect the health of mothers. The re-emergence of food and employment problems over subsequent years prompted additional concerns about the adequacy of food supplies. land resources, investment, and employment for the rapidly growing population. At the height of the 100 Flowers campaign, even Mao Zedong registered his support for cautious moves towards birth control in February 1957. Relevant passages are contained in the internal version of his pioneering speech on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. Still, the subject was considered sensitive enough to expurgate his commentary from the published version and to permit only intermittent signs of a policy change in contemporaneous sources. Likewise, another Mao speech before a Central Committee meeting of October 1957, in which he alluded positively to the need for birth planning, was published after a delay of 20 years. So Mao's remarks were made in the midst of a debate on population issues raging both inside and outside the party. It saw adherents of birth control, such as party vice chairman, Premier Zhou Enlai and his deputies, and Li Zianin and Deng Xiaoping preached against more radical followers of Mao, such as his personal secretary, party deputation, and Politburo candidate, Chen Boda. Although the latter voiced the opinion that there is no sign of overpopulation and China can provide room for at least another 600 million people, his master admitted the necessity of introducing some birth control measures once a limit of 800 million had been reached in the future. Ultimately, however, the chairman's belief in revolutionary transformation, rapid economic growth, and the positive role of population growth prevailed. And in January 1958, it led him to announce his belief in an uninterrupted revolution, to urge a general raising of plant talents, and to state bluntly that a large population is a good thing. Well, in the Great Leap Forward of 1958 to 1960, these convictions caused the termination of all birth control propaganda. Conversely, China's press began to praise the invincible force of human endeavor, enlarging on Mao's complaints about a climate of pessimism in population matters and his quip of March 1958 that at present the nation was understate of overpopulated. Many articles propounded the idea that more people mean more producers, enlarging the country's resources instead of draining them. So Liu Shaoqi, the second in command of the party, also became an adherent of this position. In an internal talk of June 1958, he joined the general chorus about the approach of the ideal communist society with astonishing asides typical of his collectivist outlook, his perennial preoccupation with organization, and a new lust for record numbers. So in this case, do not assume that under communism there will be all that individual freedom. In a certain sense, there will be a lot less freedom. When China's population has reached 6 million, I'm afraid not everyone will be able to have his own private single bed. It wouldn't surprise me if people will have to sleep in sheds. No more of this chaotic way of walking on the streets either. So this was the part of his speech. And it was only after the crisis following the Great Leap that birth control was once again put on the political agenda in 1962. In his long-term role as the discreet yet influential opponent of Mao Zedong in birth control matters, Premier Zhou Enlai had to shoulder the thankless task of reconciling the chairman's views with the emergency measures provoked by the situation. As he phrased it delicately in a speech of February 1963, he said, "A large population is a good thing, but as we are the most populous country in the world, we already have plenty of this good thing, and if we still let the population grow rapidly in an unplanned manner, it won't be a good thing anymore." 1 year later, Zhou still had to defend family planning against ideological objections within the Politburo. Typically enough, it continued to be relegated on the status of health work and earned just one line in the government reports presented to sessions of the National People's Congress in 1963 and 1964. In the Cultural Revolution, political mass campaigns again took precedence over birth control efforts. just as during the Great Leap Forward, the belief in the unlimited potential of new man proved incompatible with notions of Malthusian predicament. It was only after communist utopia once again vanished behind the grinding problems of economic construction that another change set in. Again, Zhu acted as the main promoter of renewed birth control activities, and in January 1970, the Politburo, including Mao Zedong, at long last endorsed his proposal to cease treating birth control as an aspect of health work and to deal with it instead in the context of food and economic policies. Henceforth, birth control occupied an increasingly important place in government policy. Nevertheless, Mao Zedong's ideological cons remained and circumscribed all activities. And in December 1974, we finally attached the urgently requested directive. There's no way around control of population growth to an economic report of the Planning Commission. It was due to his overpowering presence and the influence of the left-wing ideologues, however, that the party carefully refrained from including population growth among the causes of economic problems until his death in 1976. It rather sidestepped the issue by noting that human reproduction should follow the example of economic development and also be subjected to planning. But planning and the demographic research necessary for it were again highly suspect. Topics struggling with political prejudice, years of neglect, and a consequent paucity of reliable planning data. Only occasional glimpses of internal discussions permit the conclusion that old worries about the employment of the growing population prevailed among the leadership. An example are remarks of Zhang Xuanke, a left-wing member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, later to be purged as one of the Gang of Four who foresaw an end to the compulsory rustication of unemployed Shanghai youth after 1980, should birth planning be carried out satisfactorily. So, the uneasiness of the Chinese leadership concerning the country's huge population in the 1970s is a well-established fact. Whereas in 1971, the numbers used by various ministries for internal calculations differed by 80 million. The difference between the assumed population total and later numbers based on a new population census ranged to more than 100 million. Even in 1977, Chinese politicians calculated a population total that was 50 million less than the real number. When the State Statistical Bureau began to tabulate more precise data in 1978, it turned out that at the end of the Cultural Revolution, China not only faced huge economic deficits but also high population growth, the dimensions of which confirmed the misgivings of all skeptics. Essentially, the nation's population total was again underestimated in the same way and in the same range as 25 years before. Ever since, various Chinese politicians have turned the neglect of birth control in former decades a hard-to-correct historical mistake. Former Vice Premier and Central Committee Secretary Wang Renzong outlined the gravity of the mistake during a birth planning conference in January 1981. He compared the negligent population policy of former years with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, thereby bracketing it among the greatest disasters in the history of the People's Republic. And the alarm of Chinese politicians about the legacy of former policies continued to increase. Although Mao's successor, Hua Guofeng, in February 1978, believed in the possibility of lowering annual population growth to 1% within 3 years, the new census of July 1982 forced the leadership to recognize the inertia of demographic processes. Mistakes of population policy can only be corrected within 20 to 30 years, concluded Qian Xingzong, and then Minister of the Birth Planning Commission in May 1982. In addition to the sudden confrontation with the impact of formerly underestimated population developments, China's economic crisis at the end of the 1970s contributed to the design of the One-Child campaign. It lent a sense of urgency to radical policy changes and added an undercurrent of hidden pessimism to the overt optimism of the modernization program. And just as in the parallel economic debates, it led the political elite to pick up lost threads. In many respects, proponents of the one-child policy have been resuming their old arguments of the 1950s and 1960s that were silenced in the intervening years of the Maoist mass campaigns. It was with a degree of embarrassment that the Politburo took note of the fact that after 30 years of revolution, begging for food still prevailed in many places, and raising standards of living for the huge population continued to be a major stumbling block. References to the weak economic base and the high population as major constraints of China's modernization persisted as one of the most important themes of Chinese politicians between 1979 and 1981. And in March 1979, Deng Xiaoping himself saw unbearable burdens for the state, should the country fail to halve population growth within the next 5 years. Meeting a Nigerian delegation 2 years later, he confessed his fear that without birth planning, economic growth would be consumed by population growth.